start off with our panelists, Pastor David Swanson, Pastor David Washington, Pastor Watson. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes, sir.
Loud and clear, Eric.
Perfect. Well, again, thank you guys for joining us. And so I want to start off with just kind of diving into our subject with this. Oftentimes when we're talking about systemic issues in poor urban communities, a lot of time that topic of conversation is considered to be political. And there's reasons for that. And so what I want to do is I'll start out with Pastor David Washington. You lived in the Roseland community on the south side of Chicago your entire life. On the news, they tell us about all of the guns, the violence, the things that, the negative, stereotypical things in these communities. I want to know, as best you can, I want you to describe to our viewers here, our participants, what is the average person or family that lives in these communities? Who are they? What do they like? What is the culture like? How can you express the humanity that's surrounding these particular communities?
Yes. First, thank you for having me tonight, and thank you for having this important discussion that we're having tonight. The residents of Roseland are just average people trying to live and raise their families, their children. There are people that go to work. The only difference is that there are a scarcity of resources in the community. And so many of the people from the community have to drive long hours away from the community to have a livable wage, which, allow their children to, be at home most of the time by themselves. Most of them are just hardworking citizens trying to survive in an area where the school system is not that great. The health system is not that great. There is a hospital in Roseland, but no one wants to go to that hospital when they're sick. You have your elements of, crime that happens in any community of poverty because it is a mechanism of survival for those who live in the community because they know no other way. And then when you get into those who may have had trouble as young people and end up with a record, in most communities, when a young person have issue and get in trouble, they may have a rabbi or a priest or someone, to come to court with them and ask the judge to not throw their lives away over one, childish mistake. But in our case, many of the young people end up going into the system young because they don't have the resources for competent representation in law, and they end up with a record that makes it hard for them to get the kind of employment that can provide all of the things that they need. So the context is a context of people at the bottom trying to climb up as best as they can. You have maybe a third of people that try to do that, by breaking the law. And then you have another 2/3 of people who are struggling as best they can to find other ways in a context where there are not a lot of resources for them.
Gotcha. Now, is church a very important part of the culture just in general?
Absolutely. More than the last census, I believe, was it 2010? The last census is something around 70% of the people in the Roseland community attend church, have attended church, or have some type of faith. They are not, they do not fight against the gospel. Whenever we do work in the community, we share gospel in the community, people are always receptive to it. You know, you have your group of people who grow up into church and end up not going to church anymore, often because many of the churches have created a culture that really don't address the felt needs of the community. But there are spiritual people in the Roseland community and a lot of people who attend church.
Good, good. Pastor Watson, I want to jump over to you. You know, as I mentioned before, there's a lot of systemic issues and cultural misconceptions in marginalized communities that, you know, we hear all the time on the news. Can you give me like what example of what that looks like? I mean, these issues were pre-COVID-19, they'll be post-COVID-19, they're magnified during this pandemic. But can you give me an example of some of those misconceptions and how they've affected these communities?
Yes. Thank you, Eric. Thank you guys for having me here. To your pastors, Dave and John. I love you guys dearly. And Eric, what a wonderful job you're doing. And I want to thank everyone for taking time to be here. The fact that you have a church that holds such a high view of scripture and a high centrality of Jesus Christ, having a discussion around justice is not common. And so I want to thank you for taking time to listen to us. I think some misconceptions that exist. When I went to Trinity in Deerfield. One of the misconceptions I heard was that people from my kind of community on the southeast side of the city, people are don't try hard enough, are lazy, or do not take advantage of opportunities provided for them, sort of reject the whole pull yourself up by your bootstrap understanding. And I think much of those misconceptions is rooted in ignorance into what really has created the climates and context that we see. I think COVID has definitely sort of pulled the wool off of many people. No, it's pulled the wool off the situation and it's allowed some of the inequalities to really be plainly seen for the world. But, you know, policies and laws that were written over decades that relegated people in some neighborhoods and out of others, laws and policies that made decisions on where banks would be placed in communities, which determined how much money was available for schools. Those kinds of things have impacted communities like the one I pastor in and the two Davids pastor in for a long time. And so we end up hearing things about violence. We hear things about crime, and we kind of take that from in a vacuum, like it's something that's just an anomaly that's happening out of nowhere, but it's really deeply tied to other things and not necessarily just to spiritual things. I think my brother David pointed to is African Americans by and large tend to be deeply spiritual people, you know, in terms of a deep shared religious language. And much of that is part of culture, but a lot of it is very much tied to just terrible economic policies, you know, that have happened. Most don't know the deep racial history of Chicago that really finds its roots in the early 20th century, I'd argue sooner. I mean, before that even, but just even the way laws are written and how the city is even set up. Through certain policies, they give rise to different misconceptions that make people believe that all things are equal on every side of town when they're really not equal at all.
Yeah, yeah. We did a justice event last year that dealt with redlining in economics, and so it was interesting to kind of see people's reaction when they learn that racism is not just perpetuated in the hearts of humans, but it's also set up systemically to continue those effects. And so these things are real things that we have to contend with. And so I thank you for kind of illuminating us on some of those issues. I want to shift over to Pastor David Swanson. So Pastor David, you pastor a multi-ethnic church on the southeast side of Chicago. You just recently released a book, which I can't wait to read, and it's called Rediscipling the White Church, From Cheap Diversity to True Solidarity. A lot just in the title, a lot jam-packed into that. So I bring that up because in order to really understand the issues in the communities that you pastors serve in, you really have to assimilate yourself into the culture of the community. How have you been able to do that as a white man, as a white pastor? How have you been able to do that in the South Side of Chicago?
Yeah, well, just want to add my thanks, Eric, to you and the pastors and leaders of the church there for hosting us this evening. I know Pastor David Washington for many years now and got to collaborate with him, and Pastor Watson via reputation. And we were chatting before we had a meal on the books before the pandemic caused us to postpone that. So it's really a privilege to be here this evening. And to all of you, thank you for giving this time. Our church is 10 years old. We planted the congregation in the Bronzeville community back 10 years ago. That's one of the other things to be postponed right now is our 10-year anniversary celebration, but we're trusting that we'll get to do that at some point. And it was intentionally a multiracial congregation. And so if you were to visit us on a Sunday, we meet in a Park District facility and relatively evenly distributed Black, white, and then Asian American. So our church does stick out a little bit in a community that is majority African American. Bronzeville is a historic neighborhood in the city of Chicago. It was the neighborhood where African American people who were migrating from the Jim Crow South to urban centers in the North could live with a relative amount of safety in the city of Chicago. And so there are all kinds of legacy institutions in the community, as well as churches, churches that are 100 years old or longer and have been doing amazing ministry over all this time. And so personally, for me, it was very important that I understood that history and learned that history very quickly. I've had far too many conversations with church planters over the years who are convinced that they are bringing the gospel to a neighborhood, to a town, to a city. And, what not to put too fine a point on it, but what an offensive notion that somehow we are the ones to finally bring the gospel somewhere. Thankfully, and obviously, the gospel has been proclaimed and demonstrated for generations upon generations in our neighborhood. So it wasn't for us to bring the gospel. It was our job to figure out how the Holy Spirit had been moving, how the gospel had been making an impact, and then to get in line with that, to align ourselves with that stream of saints who've gone before us. And that meant making friends with other pastors in the neighborhood. And thankfully, there were some great pastors to welcome us early on. And it meant not starting any ministries in the community whatsoever, but rather just joining the stuff that was already happening in the community. And so if a church was throwing a block party, we asked, what can we do to help out? And if that meant picking up the trash or, ushering people into the to the event, then we were happy to do that. One of my pastor friends started a monthly prayer walk around local public schools in the community. And so I said, what are some schools that haven't been claimed yet? And he identified a few of those for us. And so for about the past 7 or 8 years, every single Saturday, rain, snow, sleet, shine, first Saturday of the month, our folks are out there praying around those schools alongside other churches in our community. So Eric, to your question, I think it has simply meant being very humble. It's meant being expectant that God's been doing great things in the community, and then looking for those opportunities to jump in, with other congregations and people of goodwill who are doing good gospel ministry in the neighborhood.
Good. Well, good. I just wanted to get a feel from you guys as pastors and leaders in your community, so that we can get a feel for the people that you serve, the hearts that you have, so that we're not just dealing with statistics and figures, but we're really understanding this content or this subject matter in the context of the people that you serve and the communities that you serve. So I want to kind of transition now to this COVID-19 coronavirus, stay-at-home order, all the things that we're all dealing with. and really specifically start to dig into what makes this different in these marginalized communities, what makes it more difficult. So I want to swing back to Pastor David Washington real quick and get your perspective on this from, seeing how this has affected your community, your church. What makes this more difficult than, people like us out here in the suburbs who are, sitting back in our patios, working from home, struggling because we can't go to Starbucks. What makes it more difficult in communities like yours?
Well, a significant amount of people in our community don't own their homes. And you have multiple families that live under one roof. So social distancing is almost impossible in that context. And then just finding space to separate, is difficult and challenging in our context. Many of the people in the Roseland community without, trust the public transportation to get around, they're put at risk. So it's no wonder the statistics are what they are in terms of how many, African American in the community are contracting the virus. And so factors like, many of the people in the community working in grocery stores, working in restaurants, driving Uber, all of these things are greatly impacted by the, COVID-19 virus. So it's impacting them financially. It's impacting them in terms of being unable to really social distance themselves. And when you have multiple families living under one roof, being isolated there, and everything is closed. And another factor is there are not many resources, many grocery stores. So when the panic kicks in, everyone is experiencing some sort of supply desert in the grocery stores and in the, finding cleaning supplies. That is exponentially increased in our context, and it becomes difficult. So we do as much as we can to try to, purchase and acquire supplies that we can give away, and that we can help people in our congregation, people in our community. So it's a lot of unique ways it's beginning to hit us. And that I haven't even gotten into just the chronic health issues that exist in the community that causes people to be more susceptible to the virus. So it's a myriad of issues.
Good. Pastor Watson, same question to you, sir. What are you seeing in your community?
Well, Pastor David pointed at a street that I want to drive down a little bit, where he talked about dependence on public transportation. Mm-hmm. I think also needs to be noted that African Americans and Latinos, which my church sits on the border of both communities, tend to make up the largest share of essential workers in the city. And I think we have to ask a question, and I'm not going to dwell too long on that question, is how is it that Black people tend to be relegated in positions more than others? But when you look around and you see many Black folks have to go out because they have to work. I held a daily prayer time, and several people would say on that daily prayer line, pray for me, Pastor. I have to go to work, scared as all get out, but I have to go to work because I'm considered an essential worker. And until the news hit it, people were packed on buses because they had no other opportunities. And the virus is being contracted that way. Here's another one that we found out that until recently, in terms of the last week or so, people in our communities could, if they received SNAP benefits, which is food stamp, food assistance, nutrition assistance, they could not order food. Like I have the privilege to order food from Instacart and have it delivered to my home. If you receive benefits, SNAP benefits, governmental aid for food, you could not order food online to have it delivered in your house. You had to go to the store. You can maybe order it online, but you still had to go to the store to get it. And many of them just had to go to the store. And so stores would be packed full of people. And what we now know is that, well, we knew it from the beginning, is the virus was passed by human to human transmission. And so, you know, I know the news shows that people are just out having parties and all that stuff. Every community is doing that. That's not just the Black community, it's the white community doing it too. But people early on were packing stores to get food. And again, we have to ask the questions. We have to probe those questions. Why is that? And why is that the case? But when people have no choice but to go out they don't have jobs that give them the ability to work from home, and they have to go to the grocery store to get their food, and not to mention subpar food, you know, not necessarily the greatest quality food, produce that may be molded, and you're picking over that food. You have to do what you got to do to eat. And many people in my community where my church is were forced with those two options, unless they were retired.
Wow. Pastor David Swanson, is there anything you want to piggyback on, anything that they brought up?
I think the pastors both really covered some of the underlying realities that have resulted in these massive disparities that we're seeing. And, you know, and just to kind of put make it real clear, in the state of Illinois, African Americans make up 14% of the population, but last I saw, 32% of the deaths related to COVID-19. So that's the level of when we talk about disproportionately impacted. It's not a small percentage. You know, we're talking, and across the country, Black people are dying at twice the rate as are white people from COVID-19. So we need to be really clear about what we're talking about here and why this is so incredibly important. I think it's also important, though, to say, because there's been some media narratives that have, and I think Pastor Watson was hinting at this a second ago, that have painted these disparities as though somehow it is the result of bad decision making on the part of Black communities. So anecdotally, when I'm driving around the South Side, I see a lot of people wearing masks. I mean, I see a lot of people wearing masks. When I drive up to the north side of Chicago, I drove through a park the other day. It was a sunny day. I was running an errand on the west side of Chicago, a recently gentrified neighborhood, mostly white. This park was packed. I'm telling you, it was packed. I'm looking very intentionally, predominantly white, maybe only white. I saw one person with a mask. I was out in Naperville yesterday for something all day long. Spent an hour in downtown Naperville in the evening. I'm watching, I'm looking for this. Everybody's out. It's a beautiful day. I promise you, I did not see a single person with a mask, majority white. The only people I saw with masks were two small groups of Black people walking through downtown Naperville. So I say that simply to point out that the disparities we are seeing have underlying causes that go far beyond, well, people aren't just taking care of themselves, people aren't paying attention, people aren't following public health advice. And that's the work that needs to be done, is we need to get at some of that underlying systemic inequity that leads to these really disproportionate and unjust outcomes.
Yeah. Pastor Watson, go ahead. You want to piggyback on that?
Because you pointed to it again, David Swanson, some of the underlying causes, you know, like, and I alluded to it, you know, the underlying health conditions, which is not because, you know, whatever stereotypes people believe about Black folks and Kool-Aid and fried chicken, that's not quite accurate. But, you know, I remember where my church is on 95th. And I remember when the second largest grocery store in the area closed up and was gone for years until recently. And my mother would drive, because Jewel on 95th and Stony, their produce was a joke. Would drive downtown Chicago, South Loop, to the far, far south suburbs just to get food. Now that's someone with a car. If you're someone and you have no car and you have to eat, it is human to eat. You have to eat to live. You're going to go to the place that has the most food. And one of the downsides when I go to my church is that there are really not really healthy restaurants, healthy food options there. The grocery store, the produce is a joke, and the restaurants, which none of them are Black owned, by the way, are just pedo garbage, and people have to eat. Those kinds of things, which would never really fly in any other community, those kinds of things are not the only thing, but they're one of the things that contribute to some of this underlying health, not to mention access to quality health care. David alluded to that too. Nobody wants to go to Roseland Hospital, not even to get COVID testing. And that's a running joke on the south side of Chicago. I don't want to go to Roseland. If I get shot, take me to Christ. Don't send me to Roseland. Access to adequate to top of the line healthcare, in terms of being able to afford healthcare, and in terms of being able to have good food. Those are all things that have helped, that have really exposed the chasm that exists between whites and Blacks as it relates to healthcare and as it relates to food access.
Hey, Watson, let me just add to that too. Many of those who are working at the grocery stores or, the neighborhood restaurant or clothing store, they don't get health benefits. They don't get, sick days. They don't get, any of those benefits, and not to mention personal protective equipment or any type of safety material for them to work with while they're putting themselves at risk. My son ended up having to leave his job, and he has that privilege because he knows I can take care of things, but many people do not have that, but him as a 21-year-old had enough sense to know that he was putting himself at risk and his life was worth more than that money. And a week out, he was working at the Walmart in Crestwood. A week after that, the Walmart, just a mile down on 95th, had two of its workers to not only contract the virus, but to die from the virus. And it wasn't until that happened that they began to put some of the precautions in place to protect their workers. So we deal with these type of things happening in the community, and people deal with it because they have no other option other than to deal with it.
Good. So we have a question. One of our attenders here, Megan. Is it Megan or Megan? If you can unmute yourself and go ahead and ask your question.
Sure, this is Megan. Thank you. I was just wondering, I'm sorry for being so naive, but why is the produce so bad?
That's a good question, Megan, because I kept alluding to that. I've said this in a number of formats. Well, one big answer, I don't know. Second one, this is what I've heard. I've heard that some of the produce that would get to Jewel, maybe in our communities, maybe some of the stuff that may be left over at other restaurants, at other stores that didn't sell. I've heard that, but I don't know. I know that we've complained. I've had multiple members in my church, including my mother, write letters to the corporate office of Albertsons and to complain. And that's kind of what got it shifting a bit, was because people complain. But that, I live, on the southeast side, I'm southwest side, and that just doesn't exist at the stores I go to.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
That was not a naive question, by the way. That was a good question, Megan.
Yeah, and we could maybe add to that just the reality of of food deserts in certain areas of the city, right, where there's not access to a high quality or a full service grocery store. And so a lot of, if someone's getting produce, it's maybe not from a grocery store always, but from a corner store, where the selection is going to be much more minimal. It may be in that store a lot longer of a time. And so some of it just has to do with access to high quality produce.
So that's a foreign term to those of us that live in the suburbs. Yeah, I'm familiar with it because I used to live near the west side of Chicago. But food desert, what does that mean? Like, is that, how far do people have to travel? How do they get to the store? Can you dig into that a little bit more with the meaning of that?
Yeah. So I'll jump since I was the first one to mention it. And then, so a food desert is anywhere where there is not a quality grocery store like a big box that provides quality food that's not high processed. Not all grocery stores have high processed food. All of them do. Mm-hmm. But some grocery stores are going to vary on their produce. So, so for an example, when I say my area, I can for sure tell you Roseland, until they had that Walmart, was a food desert. My area of South Shore, South Chicago, when Dominic's closed and then when Target closed, was an absolute food desert. There was one, and also what considers it too is how many people in a square mile live near a store. And so in the city, it's much more dense. And so you may have people who, where they used to be able to walk 3 or 4 blocks to the store, maybe 4 or 5 blocks to the store, now have to take multiple truck buses or have to drive more than 10, 15, 20 minutes to the nearest store. So it's not necessarily saying, well, I don't like Walmart's produce. I prefer Target, or I prefer Whole Foods. Whole Foods is not really an option there unless you go to Hyde Park. But, so that Trader Joe's, Whole Foods don't exist in those places. It's usually Jewel or what used to be Dominic's, and Mariano's. That's a maybe. Mariano's is down near you, David. But on the southeast side of Chicago, South Shore, South Chicago, Calumet Heights, for a long time until, and to kind of paint the picture, let's just say 67th Street to 103rd Street, 110th Street. That's 7 or 8 miles north and south, maybe 6 or 7 miles north and south. There were 2 grocery stores until recently that had to service. I'm on super guess on these numbers, but I can tell you 60617 has like 80,000 people in it. 606, the one right above me, which is 19 or 49, got another 60 something thousand people. I'm not even counting, the zip code that rubs up against Stony Island. But just if you look at a map and you look at the lake and you count it all the way to Stony Island, and you go from 67 on down, you zoom in on Google and see how many houses that is. That's a lot of people for 2 grocery stores.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Oh, go ahead, Dave. Go ahead.
No, I think Roseland is still a food desert. Walmart is in the Pullman area. And the thing that's happening with the Pullman area is historic, because of the Pullman, railroad and all of that. And so there are more investments being made over there in Pullman. Now, Pullman is next door to the Roseland community, but it's quite a walk, for people in the Roseland community. So even to get to the next neighboring neighborhood where the Walmart is, and let me say, it's a lower quality Walmart, even though it has the name Walmart. I won't dive too deeper into that because, Watson, you already kind of outlaid what's kind of happening. But in the 60628 zip code, there's 57,000 people, and there's not one major grocery store, no Jewel, Osco, no Whole Foods, no well, they don't do Dominick's no more, but no major grocery store. There are multiple liquor stores and that sell, you know, not the freshest produce and products in their store at inflated prices. And because many of the people are using, you know, link cost benefits, they're able to just kind of like become predators in the neighborhood that's draining the neighborhood. But that is a huge issue for the residents of Roseland is that we don't have access, though, unless you able to use public transportation or you have a car, you don't have access to good food, which causes health problems in our community.
Can I scale it a little bit, David, even to help you see it? And if you go to Division Avenue or North Avenue, Lincoln Park, which just got that $90-something million approval from TIF money, you go up there and you have Target where Cabrini Greens used to be. You're just in walking distance. You got Whole Foods. And I mean, and in that little 3 or 4 blocks, you don't have like 60. You got a lot of people, but it's not a whole zip code's worth.
Yeah. That is densely populated.
You can come up and down the street and you can pass 3 major stores. Whereas David just mentioned, you were right, David. I didn't think about that, but as soon as you said that, Roseland doesn't have a store.
Wow. So you're dealing with communities that are densely populated, multiple families living under one roof. Predominant of the people are considered essential workers. Transportation is somewhat difficult in most of these households because you're dealing with low income. So public transportation is a must. I mean, you're looking at issue on top of issue. They can't order their food online. That really kind of exaggerates this COVID-19 stay-at-home, lockdown issue. And I think it's important for us to discuss these issues because when you just hear the narrative on, like Pastor David Swanson was mentioning, when you just hear the narrative on the media, it makes it seem like, well, this is more prevalent in the Black communities because of defiance, or maybe because of, maybe suggested that Black people just in general, maybe genetically, are just more supposed to catch it. So I think it's important to discuss these issues to let us understand that as the church, we're called to love our neighbor. And so when we see issues like this, it's not for us to push back and judge them. It's for us to find out the reason so that we can be a blessing and be a help. And so I thank you guys for doing just that. I have a note here from one of our listeners, Jeff Stark. He says, for those of us that might need extra information regarding the systemic issues impacting the South Side, check out the book South Side by Natalie Moore, a WBEZ journalist. I'm not familiar with that, but I'll check that out. Someone else echoes that. Southside is one of the best books I've read that describes the systemic issues highlighted today. So we'll have to check out that book. So here's a question. This is a good one. Biblical, I'm assuming that this question is in reference to my statement, love your neighbor as yourself. Who is our neighbor? Who is our neighbor? I won't even kind of preference that. I'll just kind of throw that out to you guys. Watson, why don't you go ahead and start? What does that mean?
Dr. King preached a sermon on it called Drum Major Instinct, and I love how he did it. When you read that passage of who's our neighbor, I love that the hero of the story is a Samaritan and not a Jewish person. The Samaritan is the neighbor who's the Jewish guy gets beat up, jumped on, and then it's the religious who walk past, but it's the Samaritan who stops to help. And Jesus says, love your neighbor as yourself. Neighbor, I'd go so far as to say neighbor is not even a Christian yet. That Jesus doesn't preface that right there on a one another yet. Now, I'm not diminishing the importance of one another, but neighbor is not even Christian. Neighbor is not even the person sitting next to you. Neighbor, as I define it, and I think that the scripture would define it that way in Jesus' story, just by showing that the people who are in the story, the hero is someone who is considered in the Jewish religion to be worse than, I don't want to be vulgar on here, as I learned it in Hebrew, so I won't do it, but who is scum of earth. So it would definitely seem to suggest it's not someone in the same faith tradition as you, that your neighbor is any human being. Who Psalm 8 says is crowned with glory, who is made in the image of God, and because of that, is special to God. And when we understand who our neighbor is, and Jesus saying, love your neighbor as yourself, we would never want our neighbors to be wounded or to suffer, and we would never push away their suffering and pain, because we would never want ours to be done that way. We would understand that every human. Now, we haven't even spoken on the gospel and what the gospel calls us to do to bring every human to Jesus. But before we get there, we have to know that every human is made in the image of God and therefore carries inherent dignity from God. And when we let another human be wounded and we remain silent and we don't love our neighbor as ourselves, Nicholas Waltersdorf would say that we are allowing our neighbor to be wounded. And God himself is being wounded because his image is being besmirched and spat upon. And so your neighbor is anybody who is human, any human, whether they are black, white, yeah.
Gotcha. Pastor David Swanson, can you piggyback on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's I have so many thoughts on this question. Olivia, who answered or asked it, I don't know if she was even expecting us to go this deep on her question as Watson did just now, but I love it. So I think one of the most convicting assumptions in the New Testament for me is that Christians are not to conform ourselves to the patterns of this world. Right, this is what Paul talks about in Romans, and we imagine that in different kinds of ways, what that means. But oftentimes, and I'm speaking as a white person here, oftentimes we have neglected the racial patterns of this world. We've neglected even to see the racial patterns of this world. Now, what does that have to do with being a neighbor? When you all had a previous session on redlining, I'm sure you got into the fact that the way our neighborhoods, our towns, our suburbs, our cities are organized is not accidental. It's not a matter of personal preference. It's not just that a whole bunch of white people said, oh, we just kind of want to live over here and some black people over here. Like, no, there was the force of federal policy behind that, right? Like federally backed legislation that said, you can live here, you're not allowed to live here. We're going to invest massive resources in this community, and we're going to disinvest from this community, okay? So that is the pattern. That's the racialized pattern of our society that we live in. So when scripture says not to conform ourselves to the patterns of this world, then the question of who is our neighbor gets to be, for me, a little bit more interesting. Yes, it's certainly the person who lives next door to me. But as a Christian, I'm also going to become aware that the person who lives next to me does so, in part at least, because of some unjust patterns in this world. And so I'm going to expand my understanding of who my neighbor is, and I'm going to seek to break out of those racialized patterns in this world to start seeing people who might live on that side of the tracks or that side of town or that side of the city as my neighbors, because I now understand that we have been intentionally separated and segregated from one another. And as a Christian, I can't be content with that because the gospel calls me not to conform to those wicked patterns in this world. So I'm going to have to live counterculturally. Second thing I'll say very briefly, I know Watson intentionally wasn't applying this to other Christians, which I thought I appreciated that. I think you also can apply that question to other Christians as well. And I want to say that I have far more in common with anybody who has trusted in the shed blood of Jesus Christ than somebody who just happens to share my skin color, my race. That's what Scripture says, that following Jesus may cause me to lose father, mother, sister, brother, biological ties, and yet we gain access to the family of God that transcends all of those biological ties, or in our day, racial ties, and instead unites us through the shed blood of Jesus. And so there's an ecclesial question, there's a people of God question in the neighbor question as well, which is to say, who am I now related to in Christ Jesus? And is the way I'm living my day-to-day life expressing that connection with people who I am related to through the blood of Jesus Christ? That too needs to be expressed in the question of who my neighbor is.
Well said. And I can't say that Olivia did expect you to go that deep. That happens to be my mom, so I know her. She appreciates the thorough and in-depth answer. Pastor David Washington, did you have anything to say on that particular question?
Not much to add from what Pastor Swanson and Pastor Watson mentioned, but I will say there's a distinction between who God says our neighbor is and who we allow to be our neighbor. We see certain people as being our neighbor, and I think you're right on point, Watson, when you said that our neighbor is humanity. We have to get to a place where we are able to see our human connection. I think to a certain degree, COVID-19 is allowing us to see how the whole world and humanity is connected and how we have to work together, so that's one positive thing that's coming out of this. But the fact that Jesus has to tell a parable to answer the question of who our neighbor is just points to the fact that this group of people were only seeing certain people, as their neighbor, and forgetting the fact that all of us are in this together. And to piggyback a little on what Pastor Swanson is saying about our Christian connection and the blood of Christ bringing us together, as the family of God. I would say we as Christians are brothers and sisters, but the world is our neighbor. The world, that we have a family tie, that we are really wrestling with allowing patriotism, the culture of the world, to dilute what the blood of Christ has purchased for us. And until we get to a place where the hurts in our community, when I say our, I mean the low-income African-American communities, police brutality and all of that, until those hurts are felt and advocated for and spoken out against by our brothers and sisters who may not be experiencing that, but understanding the fact that our brothers and our sisters are going through that. I think we have a problem with even seeing ourselves as the family of God before we can even get to the issue of who is our neighbor, our earthly neighbor.
Good. I love that comment, that we're brothers and sisters in Christ and the world is our neighbor. Profound statement. We have a question. Randy McFarland has a good question. Randy, if you can hear me, can you unmute yourself and go ahead and ask your question?
All right. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Good evening.
How you doing? Go ahead.
My question to the panel is, how familiar are you with the how competitive food source have become in the different communities in Chicago and the different suburbs, practically as if there's a bidding war that has dissipated somewhat, but prior to now, there was a serious bidding war and competitive nature in regards to food sources to feed various communities in Chicago and in the suburbs. I want to know if any of you were familiar with this situation, and if so, how did it affect your immediate community?
Are you guys familiar with that?
I can't say I am. I can imagine it to be the case, but I don't have any factual information on it.
Okay. Randy, do you have any inside information on that?
Well, it's what we've experienced with our distribution. It's with different food sources, different organizations that we were primarily receiving food from. Once the panic of COVID-19 set in, when everyone started grabbing, it was a food grab, there was a serious concern about being able to cater to the community that we have been catering to, which is Proviso Township. And we found ourselves not only just in the midst of competing for food sources with other organizations, we found ourselves with unfortunately, with certain elected officials trying to get food sources for their immediate area. So it somewhat became like a bidding war. It's died down, but it's just something that we've experienced. And we had a discussion with other organizations. I was just kind of concerned, wondering if that was an issue on the south side, north side, west side, if they experienced it also.
Well, thanks for that information. That's not something that I was familiar with either. So I'm sure that's something we can all educate ourselves on a little bit better. So thanks for that information, Randy. I want to just take a moment to kind of pivot to our last point under the umbrella of the COVID-19 issues. Again, still dealing with some of the systemic effects. In terms of like the educational system, has been very difficult to kind of navigate that piece of it as well in these communities. So what are some of the additional stressors in those communities as it relates to the stay-at-home order, dealing with children and going to school and not being able to go to school, and some of the ripple effects that has caused in these communities as well? I don't know who wants to go first on that, but I think that's something that we should talk about and address as well.
Well, one of the things is children missing out on meals. You know, many people depend on 2 meals at school a day. You know, they get the breakfast when they first get there. They get the lunch in the afternoon, and it helps with their nutrition. And so, when all of this happened, it kind of disrupted that. And another issue is just as it relates to them being in school, together in close spaces and working together, that just created a unsafe environment for the young people to be in, and which they had no control over. And again, going back into the context where there are multiple families in the homes, and so it just causes a quicker, greater spread, of the virus in a community because of that.
Yeah. Pastor Watson, you want to piggyback on that? Anything to add?
Sorry, I muted my thing. My kids in the background.
That's all right.
But I think one of the things that I've been really concerned about that's really, really troubled my heart lately is thinking about people who are already struggling with paying for healthcare. I mean, not healthcare, childcare, affordable childcare, and many who are gonna really struggle because with everything being shut down. Like I think about like some of the essential workers and like who's keeping their children. And nobody's there, and they're having to make decisions like I'm an essential worker, which in some cases that means you're an hourly worker and you don't work, you literally don't get paid, and you're having to make the decision of staying home watching my kids. And to David's point, many of the, and I have a lot of criticisms against the school district, Chicago School District and the Illinois State Board of Education, but I will acknowledge the fact that they have been a source of food for people, and that I haven't heard lately. I don't know, but that they were providing food 3 meals a day. If you needed them to come get them, you could come get them and take them home. And they even would let you take enough home for family people too. So I admire that that even with this shutdown, it was present. So.
That's
I
good.
don't have much to add on that other than those two concerns I thought about.
Okay. Pastor Swanson?
Yeah, just real briefly, if you as a parent do not have the ability to work from home or the privilege to work from home, then you're not there to assist your child. You got an elementary age child who maybe you could leave at home. But those of us who are able to work from home, we can be continually involved in our child's education. And that's not going to be the case for many of our neighbors. And then secondly, just has to do with access to technology, access to internet. Not everybody has internet. Yeah. Not everybody has a Chromebook. When this thing happened, we were just talking like, okay, so, you pull up your internet, you pull up your Chromebook or whatever, and you're going to be fine, Mm-hmm. Now, look, it's complicated enough to do homeschooling if you've got great internet connection, if you got all the technology you need, right? But then you put on top of that, if you don't have access to that, you're just done at that point. There's no plan B. There's no other alternative to get the access to your child's education. And that is a reality for many of our neighbors. Now, I know there's churches who are doing a great work providing, laptops for families and helping with some of those kinds of things. But that is a real issue. And as we go into the fall and start thinking about how much longer does this last, that's a real concern. There's already massive disparities in our educational system. And it seems as though this is just going to exacerbate those pre-existing disparities.
Yeah.
Can I add something to that, Eric?
Yeah, go ahead.
That hit me. As David pointed out something, David Swanson pointed out something. And my wife is a teacher, and as the school district was transitioning to this online format, just a serious disparity that was real here in Chicago was North Side schools were getting technology before South Side schools, or schools that had more money were able to provide more laptops and more iPads, and the city had to hustle because that was not looking good to the city. The city had to hustle really fast to try to cover that. And that gap existed for like a good week, where schools on the North Side were, that was no issue. And I'm not saying that there weren't some students that didn't fall through the crack, but that was a massive disparity that, again, COVID used to show a serious, a lot of people believed that because we have public education, that it's all equal and the funding is equal and we all pay taxes and the money is cut properly and everyone is getting the same amount of money. And what COVID showed is that is not the case. Even in a city like Chicago, there were sections and segments of the city where the tax base is higher and their schools have more money, and they had no problem. Maybe the parents struggled with, having to be teachers, but had no problem technologically. Whereas my wife will tell you this, she had students who 2 weeks into that, parents were calling saying, I haven't heard from anybody. How come we don't have anything? They talking about on the news that, I was about to say Von Steuben. I don't know why I want to say Von Steuben, but some school on the north side, they have all that they need. And these are all Chicago public schools that all of us pay taxes for. Mm-hmm. And that's a real disparity that exists.
Wow. Thanks for pointing that out, Watson. We have a really good question. I want Chris Smith put a really good question in the chat. I would love for him to jump on real quick and ask this question live so we can all hear this and give our panelists an opportunity to respond. Chris, can you hear me?
I sure can. And it's a her.
Oh, it's a her.
Yes.
Sorry about that, Chris.
But Chris for sure. No problem. Yes. What I was saying is, while COVID-19 has brought about some of the best we've seen in people, our neighbors, our communities, etc., as this lingers on, it is also bringing out some of the absolute worst we have seen in people. And it seems like of late, we're starting to go the round versus, well, taking a step back, how do we, as a community in large, help show our neighbors, our community, cities, states, that the systemic racism is what has really, really made more of an impact on the Black and the brown communities, the people of color, and not only first getting COVID-19, but having more of the serious ramifications of it, including death. And it seems like what we're seeing, or at least what I'm noticing in the past couple of weeks, is you see more people blaming people of color. And I was watching one of the updates with Governor Pritzker and Dr. Ezeki, and a reporter literally asked, why do we have to be punished for the people of Chicago? And that is just insane. And you're seeing more hatred, even in Naperville. A sign of white power and a cross went up in the last couple of days on the outside of a playground. I mean, it's just crazy.
Yeah, I happened to see that earlier today, actually, right in my neighboring community. You guys want to kind of tackle that? There was a lot kind of woven into that question, but who wants to take a stab at some of the issues in that question?
I'll jump. So that's true. We have a friend, Sean Marshall, who was at a store, and some women, 2 white women, saw him walk down the aisle, and they started kind of saying "COVID, COVID, COVID" to each other about him. I think, and this is where, I'm not going to drive on the street too much, but I will point to it. This is where politics and people's representative voice comes in, because a lot of this stuff has to deals with allocation of funds and how funds are spent, who gets what and who doesn't. And I think that these are the places which I'm not at all here to tell anybody how to vote. I'm not making even any assumptions on that. But whoever you voted for is representing you in that position. And I've said this to people, you need to be writing letters to your representative. And even if that person is not the representative of, say, 60628 or David, what is 60620, Swanson?
60653, yeah. Sorry
about that. 60653, to press your people that you voted for on a local, it's difficult what the suburban people can do, but at least on a state sense, because they're dealing with the allocations of state money. And then on a federal sense, I mean, I'm not going to park on that street. All I'll say is this: letters need to be written and voices need to be heard from Christians who who may not be in those settings, because we raise our voices and our voices don't get heard. They get written off as, angry Black people or whatever. But there's something about the voice of angry white people, I hate to say it that way, that tends to move some chain posts a lot faster. And so you may be one voice among many, or you may be one voice in an ocean of no voices. But I think write letters until you can't write them anymore. Tweet your representative and say, this is what's happening in wherever, and this is not right. I voted for you to vote for my interest, and this is my interest. Use that voice. That's one. There are multiple ways, but that's the one that came to my mind. And I'm certain these other two men have great ones.
Pastor Swanson, you want to add to that?
Well, just going back to some of my observations earlier about how we're seeing, residents here on the South Side have to really take this virus seriously because of the disproportionate impact. I think those of us who are white and find ourselves in, majority white spaces, we have the opportunity to be ambassadors in those spaces. I've had multiple conversations over the past couple of weeks with white people where they've said, is it really that bad? Yeah. And what they're saying is, it hasn't touched me personally. And I understand that. Look, I mean, if something doesn't impact me personally, it's not necessarily top of mind. But we know that it is impacting people who we are connected to through Christ. Even if I live in a majority white setting and I don't know anybody who's been impacted, now I know that my family in Christ is suffering under this. And so I think those of us who find ourselves in those kinds of more privileged spaces have the opportunity to be ambassadors, to communicate the realities that are not necessarily being felt in some of those places, to be agents of reconciliation in that way, to advocate for those, because it really is, we live in a very divided and segregated society right now. And we all exist in our own echo chambers. And so it's unfortunate, but the reality is that you could live, I don't know, David Washington, 10 miles away from Roseland, 15 miles away from Roseland, and literally have no idea what's happening in Roseland right now. That's very, very possible. So I do think it's incumbent on some of us to take up that mantle of being an ambassador and speaking these realities out so people can be informed and understand what's actually happening.
Well said. Pastor David Washington, do you have anything to add to that?
I'll just say pressure doesn't create the worst in us, it reveals it. It's times like these that show us who we are really as human beings, from the simple things of hoarding and buying more than you really need, rather than, helping your neighbor to get the things that they need. I think it is just revealing the worst in human nature. I don't think, it seems as if racism is getting worse in America, but it's not getting worse, it's getting filmed. It's getting exposed. And for whatever reason, the climate of culture is shifting to a point where people, it's not a shameful thing for people. And people feel comfortable coming out with it, feeling comfortable being more vocal and painting racist vandalism in communities and things of this nature. And we have to ask, what is making people feel safe to do that now? What is causing people to feel like this is the time to come out and say these things? And I think we need to kind of reflect on that kind of question and ask us, when did these things start getting more public, and what happened before they started getting more public, to try to trace, try to tie where is this energy coming from, and what we need to do to try to bring an end to it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's a great point to transition on. But before we do, because I want to leave time for each of you to kind of give your input on the murder of George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery. So I want to transition that, but I want you all each to quickly, maybe in like a couple of minutes, let our attenders here know what is your church doing, and maybe it's your church individually or you've partnered with other churches. What are you doing in your community during this COVID-19 crisis to meet those needs of your congregation and your community? Something maybe that you didn't have to do before, but you've had to implement during this time. So we'll start back with you, Pastor David Washington, and then we'll kind of go to Pastor Watson and end up with Pastor Swanson.
Well, one thing that has happened is this whole situation has strengthened our communication process. So I mean, at the basic level, we just meet human needs. We've bought groceries. We've written checks to people very early, even before the stay-at-home order. Many people had been laid off without pay. There are people still trying to get unemployment that the whole system of how that works, it seems impossible, and a lot of people are giving up on it. So just meeting the basic human needs of people in the congregation, making sure that we buy what we can buy in bulk and give it away, whether it's masks for people, whether it's cleaning supplies, bleach, wipes and things of that nature. And then having the lines of communication open, whereby if there are things that people are struggling with and dealing with, that they could reach us. And the joy is, if we're not able to do it because we are a small church, we are in partnership with other churches that have been helpful in allowing us to meet some of the needs that maybe we can't meet on our own as one congregation.
Good. That's Watson.
Yeah, so we got a few irons in the pot. So first, one of the things we did when we heard about the situation with the SNAP benefits and not being able to purchase groceries, myself, Pastor Charlie Dates, Pastor Derek Puckett, Pastor Eric Rivera, and Pastor Brian Dye jumped on a call very similar to this, a Zoom call. And, we said some choice words about that situation, and we took it on. And actually your church was one of the first churches to partner with us in this, where we provided groceries for people on the South and the West Side. We had groceries delivered to people's houses using Instacart, which touched 3,000 plus people. Hundreds of thousands of dollars was spent on that endeavor alone. And so, I never got a chance to thank y'all. I know you're just a segment of the church. You guys have like 9 million campuses. Thank you. and for your willingness to support us with this. That's one. Two, we also, I have a fear that food is a problem right now. And so we are working to, we have a pretty big building, our church does, and I want to use some space to be a temporary dispensary for the Greater Food Depository. We currently partner with Trinity Hospital, which is a hospital near us, to pass out food for a select group of people in the neighborhood, but I want to do something a little larger, and those conversations are being had. We've done, because I early on felt like, I believe that we're in a better place the more we know who's sick and where the hot spots are. And that's not because I've bitten a political apple. It just makes logical sense. Where we know people are sick, we can isolate people who are sick, get them better, and stop the spread. And since I know that my community is full of essential workers, I've been adamant about testing. So I've been on the behinds of my local politicians about testing. And so we had a temporary testing site at the church. And finally, there is a high likelihood that starting next week, we will probably have a permanent testing set up, the first of its kind at our church. That's like 90% certain. And so that's one thing that we're doing. And then we're just available, anytime. I'm fairly accessible. I'm on Facebook every morning. And and it has happened, if someone says to me on Facebook, I have a need for groceries, we're gonna buy your groceries. And we created a fund for our church, from our church, to be able to do that, to be able to meet anybody's needs. Compassion people first, because those are our people. I mean, just they pay the tithe. So, those are our people. But then people in the community, if needs arise, we're going to do it. I wish I had bought masks early. I just wasn't forward thinking enough to do it. I really wish I had, but we're going to we're partnering with Trinity Hospital to pass out 80,000 cloth masks in the next 2 weeks. And so there is that.
Gotcha. Pastor David?
Yeah, I'm just in awe of these guys and what they're doing. We have a nonprofit that's a few years old, New Community Outreach, that does restorative justice programming in one of our local high schools, Diet High School here in the community. So obviously we can't meet in person with those students now, but we are continuing to meet via Zoom and one-on-one contacts. We're doing some one-on-one visits to make sure they have everything they need technology-wise, and then just keeping them encouraged and connected so that they're continuing on in their studies. We're partnering with Chicago Delivers to feed some senior citizens in our community. And then we keep a community garden as well at one of the local elementary schools that typically has been used in the school's curriculum for the students, the elementary school students. This year, we're just going to try to grow as much produce as we possibly can and try to distribute that at some of our food pantries and other sources in the community to provide some fresh produce for some of our neighbors.
Very good. Very good. Well, I want to transition here in our last few minutes. Like I mentioned earlier, the issue, again, this seems to be an old movie that we watched many times before, with killing of unarmed Black men in various situations and circumstances. So I want to know, and we'll start back with you, Pastor David Swanson. What do you think it's important for us to know, specifically people that are in the church? Why is this an important issue that we pay attention to, speak to, and actually become a part of?
Oh man, yeah, it's it's hard to even know how to answer that question. These are not isolated incidents. They are kind of symptoms of an ongoing reality. There's a man by the name of Brian Stevenson who started the Equal Justice Initiative down in Alabama and wrote a really important book called Just Mercy. And he describes that our country has believed what he calls the narrative of racial difference. And that's sort of how we justified a lot of the atrocities in our history, which is to say that there's biological differences between people of different races. And that he says we've never really repented of that. We've never really acknowledged that. I think for those of us who are Christians, when we see, Ahmaud Arbery being killed, when we read about even, it's different circumstances, but even someone like Breonna Taylor recently, when we see these moments, we need to be reminded of the pattern of our society, the racialized pattern of our society. We need to not see these things as just these occasional horrific things that happen. This is the mistake that many of us white Christians make, is we think about racism as one really horribly racist person, you know, or somebody who gets caught saying some obvious racist things. But the reality is that these things run deeper, and there's a bend to our society that we've been talking about all evening, that leads to not just individuals being harmed, but entire communities of people suffering disproportionately. And so I hope that for our churches, that when we see these moments, we realize that it's evidence of something that is opposed to the kingdom of God that Jesus came proclaiming and bringing near. I hope that we also pay attention to the fact, particularly those of us who are white, that our sisters and brothers are grieving profoundly in moments like this, are being reminded of their vulnerability to violence in our society. And that it's an opportunity for us to stand in solidarity, to stand in compassion, to stand in grief and in lament. That these kinds of moments can be painful invitations, but invitations nonetheless to draw near, to become more of that unified body that Jesus prayed for with his disciples. So for me personally, I'm thinking about pastoring our people right now, many of them who are angry, who are sad, who are tired, who are in their bodies tense, you know. And I'm hopeful some days, prayerful, that more and more of the church in America will see these kinds of moments and not just excuse them as occasional incidents, but see the bigger picture and see how the body of Christ is impacted in these kinds of moments.
Yeah, well said. You mentioned the anger. I'm Facebook friends with all three of you gentlemen, and I was reading Pastor David Washington's some of his posts, and I think the frustration was obvious. Pastor David Washington, I want you to kind of elaborate and try to express a little bit more of the anger of the Black community because of incidents like this.
It's such a feeling of hopelessness. We're told to trust the system to work these things out. We as faith leaders are urged to push that same narrative, you know, to our people. I find it extremely difficult to ask people to hope for something that I can't even find hope for myself. It becomes an issue of what is going to happen if the system continues to play out like it's been playing out. It seems as if we have no other alternative for justice or even for the protection and safety of our lives than to do something that is unlawful or to begin to do things that are unlawful. If our country and those who are supposed to serve and protect us are unwilling or unable to protect us as a people, then what are we to do? I can't imagine as a father watching a police officer choke my son and hearing my son scream for mama, hearing my son saying, I can't breathe, and an officer is casually with his hands in his pocket, ignoring those cries. So the quote unquote Christian thing to do, which really isn't the Christian thing to do, but what people perceive as the Christian thing to do, is to sit back and let it work itself out. To not, we are, as an African American people, we are moving closer and closer to a place where we have to protect ourselves, our children, and our community from the law. We are moving closer and closer to that place. And it's dangerous and it's scary, but I can't theologically or logically think of any other alternative if the law isn't going to hold everyone accountable for breaking the law. So we're at this place where we're at a loss of what to do in terms to stop these type of things. I am convinced in my heart that many of the officers that are committing these murders know that they have the backing of the law with them, know that they are going to have no punitive action taken towards them. And so they are more likely. At the same time, there is no way they would have felt justified or even protected by the law to do the same thing to a white man in a white community.
That's right.
Because they know it wouldn't hold up under that. So clearly it seems like the system is not in our favor. And if the system is not in our favor, then we have to begin. I'm of a new generation, a new leadership where if the old things aren't working, we need to come up with the new. I think it's biblical. I think it's logical.
Well said. Pastor Watson, you get the last word, and then I'm going to have my lead pastors on with us, John Ferguson. I'm going to ask him to close us out in prayer. Pastor Watson.
So I want to say, I feel encouraged by the fact, I'm looking through here and I've kind of tossed through the pages and I see people taking notes. I see people listening intently. And, I have to say that, it's easy to go to mainline churches, liberal churches, some who have very little view of Bible, very low understanding of Jesus, high understanding of people. And it's easy to have these conversations. They'll even amen you, put on a Black Lives Matter shirt. And I think the thing that's been extremely frustrating is people who believe as I do about Jesus. And I keep saying that because there has to be, you got to say that nowadays, that people who believe as I do have just historically in America either been historically active in the segregation and injustice toward Black people, or just absolutely silent and passive on the sidelines. And I got to say, I'm encouraged to see people like listening, learning, and engaging. So I think for me, one of the things that gives me solace in this time, and that I've tried to do in this day, just this day, I had to talk to my congregation as well as other people who are close to my congregation about this. I could not talk about it, but I had to talk about it, especially given Ahmaud Arbery's situation. And for me, what gives me solace is understanding who Jesus is according to the Bible. And let me explain what I mean by this. When you look at the scripture, you see a constant theme over and over again. And I think people who read the scripture from my position tend to see it easier and quicker, that God is the God of the underdog. and I mean, and I could run the roll call from the people of Israel to being in slavery under an empire, the strongest empire in the world. God heard their cry. And we don't think about this, but the people of Israel were a ragtag group of people. They were not a massive majority. They were a small minority. God heard their cry and he set them free. God called David, who did not look like a king. But even if you read through the Psalms, you read through, I took a note here, one Psalm that stands out, which is Psalm 145, that the Lord is the maker of heaven and earth, the sea and everything in them. He remains faithful forever. Verse 7, executing justice for the exploited and giving food to the hungry. The Lord frees prisoners, and we have a negative view of prisoners here. We mark them for life and keep them out of jobs. The Lord opens the eyes of the blinds and raises up those who are oppressed. That God, at the end of the day, I don't know how to logically make sense of this in my theological categories, how God can love his church, who Jesus died and spilled blood for, and have love for oppressed, that some of whom ain't even in his church. I don't know how to make sense of it other than it's something about God that when I understand Jesus, who stood up in the temple and in Luke 4 defined his ministry and could have chosen anywhere to start, could have picked Isaiah 53. And some commentators, as Dr. Dates noted, said he just picked it up and it was there. Well, he could have scrolled up to Isaiah 53, but he started at Isaiah 61. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me to preach the good news to the poor, to see the captive set free. Now, even anytime you quote that verse, many of our evangelical scholars immediately assume and write you off or me off as a liberationist and therefore cut everything I have to say and call me a heretic. But it's in the scriptures. And I'm just going to say, I don't think anybody on this call holds the Bible higher than me. And I'm not saying anyone in here does not hold the Bible high. I don't think anybody does, because I boast in that, not in that sense. But Jesus, when he died on the cross, he died for our sins, right? But when he was put on the cross, didn't nobody think about no sins. Who killed him? Religious leaders who were also the political leaders of the nation. Who gave the okay to his killing? Pilate, who, although he washed his hands, traded his position for Barabbas, a murderer. And Jesus died a death of a criminal. He was killed at the hand of the state. And Countee Cullen writes a poem during the Harlem Renaissance called Black Jesus, where he is making a point that is highly theological, where he is showing and lifting up the notion that Jesus identifies with the broken and the oppressed and the pushed down. That Jesus is not found in the halls of Congress and on the walls of Wall Street, but he was in the halls and the walls of the projects and the Robert Taylor homes. That Jesus identifies. Now, I'm not saying he don't save people who don't categorize that. I don't necessarily categorize that. I'm a middle class, upper middle class Black man. That's just what that is. And I'm saved by his precious blood. But he identifies with those who are the last, and the left out. And so here's why I didn't mean to go theological, but this is really what helps me. The fact that Jesus understands my pain, that when I get up, I lamented, and I read Psalm 22 to my church, and I cried, and people wept on social media about this, that Jesus understood my tears because he himself was there. Mm. What does that say to me then? It doesn't mean that I throw my hands up and say, it'll get better in the sweet by and by. No, it says to me, and I said this to my church, and I say this to you, and David Swanson pointed at this, that we represent a kingdom that is here and not here. We represent a kingdom that marches to different orders, far different orders than the political left or the political right. And that if you're faithful to the kingdom orders of love, justice, grace, mercy, peace, and continued on, humility, gentleness, that if you're faithful to the virtues of the kingdom, it does not sit squarely in any part.
That's right.
That your faithfulness to Jesus demands, hear me say it again, it demands that if indeed you have been purchased by his blood, it says that your mouth cannot be shut.
Yes.
That you raise your voice to the loudest mountain, even if your family members and your neighbors call you crazy. Prophets are always without honor in their own home. You say what is true and what is real, that the gospel of Jesus calls every Christian to say something, and when you don't, you're in sin. And when you don't weep with those who weep, stand on the side of those who are hurting, you literally punch a hole in the gospel that we preach, and we give an empty gospel to the world.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone can see it but us.
Wow. The only thing I'm mad about now is I got you guys stirred up and we got to close. This was a powerful thing. And I know we couldn't do that topic justice, but I wanted to touch on it. I don't want to be tone deaf and just ignore it. We're going to have to maybe do something maybe later in June or something to revisit this particular topic and dig deeper into it. But we got to close. We got some great questions I was not able to get to, but we'll have to revisit this topic a little bit at a later time. I want to ask my lead pastor, John Ferguson. I think he's on. It looks like Dave is on too. But I asked John if he can close us out in prayer. I would appreciate it. And I just want to say I am very, very proud of the responses of both of my lead pastors during this situation. As a person of color, as a staff member, I'm honored to serve under these two men, and the response of them as white men, but more importantly, kingdom men, has been outstanding, and I'm very proud of it. So I just want to ask John to come on and close us out in prayer, if you would.
Sure thing, Eric. Thanks for hosting this. And wow, Reverend Jones and Pastor David, both Pastor Davids. It's been an honor tonight to sit under your leadership and teaching and just learn from your wisdom and experience. This is invaluable, and we're just grateful for you as brothers in Christ, and definitely consider you friends on mission. I've known David and Watson for a while. David Swanson and I were Facebook friends as of about 3 days ago, so I think that makes us almost best friends. I look forward to getting to know you too, David. But I just want to ask everybody if they would to just, if you haven't yet, write these men's their names down as they're doing the kingdom work they're doing in the places that they're doing it, and please commit to praying for them every day, if you would, for the next week. I want them to feel our prayers and know that we're asking the Spirit of God to be with them as they go about what they're doing, which is the good work of kingdom work here in our city. So I'm not going to say anything more. Watson preached, and that was like church. So I'm going to say a prayer, and we'll be done here. Father God, we are grateful the opportunity that we can come together like this in what are difficult times for sure. And we're, Father, just ask you to bless Reverend Watson Jones and Pastor David Washington, Pastor David Swanson. Lord, watch over their steps. Lord, protect their families. God, just fill them with courage and peace and understanding and love and patience. God, give them words to speak prophetically when they need to. Give them words to speak powerfully when they need to. Give them words to speak lovingly and kind when they need to. Lord, just help them to feel our prayers, building them up, supporting them, and that help them to know they have brothers and sisters all over this city that love them and care for them and are behind them completely. Lord, the events of the past week sadden us. They anger us. Lord, I pray that each and every one of us, God, could look inside for any bias or racism that we hold in our hearts, Lord, that we can confess that and give that to you and ask your love and peace to replace that, God. We want to, Lord, act justly. We want to love mercy. We want to walk humbly with you. And Lord, we just ask for your help in that. God bless each person that's been on this. Help us to remember what we've learned tonight and take it with us and speak boldly in your name. We pray this in your name. Amen.
Amen.
Man.
Thank you, John. Thank you, everybody, for attending tonight. And lastly, for those of you that were asking about the recording of tonight's session, it will be posted on our Community 412 Facebook page probably tomorrow afternoon, so you can watch this in its entirety. It'll be posted there for at least about 2 weeks, so you can find it there. God bless you guys. Thank you for joining us. Thank you to our guests, and we'll see you next time.